everybody. Today I will be covering chapter 4 and we're going to focus exactly on working with loops in Java and working with files. These are the topics that we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about the increment and decrement operators, the while loop, the do while loop, the for loop, how you would use the while loop for input validation, what are sentinel values, how to run a total, then a couple of nested loops, break and continue statements, deciding which loop to use, introduction to file input and output, and how to generate random numbers with the random class. So all of these topics should be familiar to you because we've covered them in Java. In Python. The only difference is I'm going to show you how they are implemented in Java and what are the differences and how to use them in your code when you're coding in Java. So let's start with the increment and decrement operators. So whenever you need to increase your number by 1, as you can see here, increase or decrease number equals number plus 1. This is the way you would do it in Java. Number equals number minus 1. However, this is quite lengthy and Java will provide you with a shorter way to do that. And all you have to do is just type the name of your variable and then either 2 pluses or either 2 minuses in front of that name or before that name. And of course follow with the semicolon because this is Java and every Java statement has to end with the semicolon. So name, double plus or double minus will do the same operations as here. So I'm not gonna focus too much on these loops because we already covered them in PLD 101. The thing that I will focus the most is the syntax on how to write them in Java. So this is the form of a while loop in Java. We have to remember a little reminder that while is a pretest loop and it executes only while your condition is true. So this is the way you would write it. You would put a keyword while, then you would open your parentheses, then you would put your condition, close the parentheses, open the curly braces, and then you would put all of your Java statements that you want to be executed inside of that loop with a semicolon after each one, and at the end you would close the curly braces. And another couple of reminders: if your loop does not end, it's going to be called an infinite loop, so you have to set your condition to false somewhere in the loop if you want it to end. Otherwise it's going to be an infinite loop. And a while loop can execute 0 or more times, so if your condition is false to begin with, your statements will not execute. This is a flowchart for a while loop. So is our expression true? If it is true, then we provide our coding statements and our loop executes something, and then we go back and it just repeats over and over and over and over again. However, if our expression is false, we just exit our loop and we're done. Here is an example of an infinite loop in Java. So we have a declaration of our variable x that's going to equal to 20. Now, while our x is greater than 0, we want to print x is greater than 0. This will be an infinite loop, and it's just going to be printing out x is greater than 0 for as long as your computer runs. So to avoid this, we have to add a x minus minus somewhere in our loop, inside of our loop, and what that's going to do is that's just going to decrease the value of x by 1 every time our loop runs. So this is the version. So as you can see, this version will decrement x after each iteration of our loop, and this way after our loop gets to 0, we will exit this loop because this condition will evaluate to false. So the block statements. So whenever you have a lot of statements that you want to do, for example, here we have 2 statements. We have one statement right here and we have one statement right here. 2 statements, 1 statement. Even if you have just 1 statement, you have to use the curly braces. And right here, the more curly braces you have, the more statements you have, the curly braces are not being affected. You have to use them the same way you would use them with block if statements. So open curly brace, whatever you want this loop to do, close curly brace. So you can use a while loop for your input validations, and if you remember from our last class, input validation is just ensuring that whatever user provides you as any input the user provides to your program, that it is valid and it is in the range of numbers that we want to see, or in the range of values that we want to see. For example, here we're asking the user enter a number in the range of 1 through 100, and then we ask them for input right here. Then we validate that input with a while loop. And what do we ask? What is our condition? If the number is less than 1 or the number is greater than 100, because we are asking them for a range from 1 through 100, right? So we need to check if the input is invalid, and this is how we do it. And remember that this sign right here is OR, and this would mean AND, or a similar sign. I'm not a really good drawer, but yeah, system.out.print, we would print that number is invalid, enter number in the range of 1 through 100, and then we would ask for the input again. So as long as the user types any number that is not in the range, we would throw a fuss at them and we would throw an error asking the user to type an appropriate number. So this is how input validation works in Java with a while loop. The next loop that we're going to talk about called the do-while loop, and do-while loop is a post-test loop, which basically means that it's going to execute whatever statements you put here at least once, and then it's going to check the condition. So do something and then check the condition. And that's the format of a do-while loop, where you have to put a keyword do, then open the curly braces, put some statements of code in here, what you want this loop to do, with ending with a semicolon, then close the curly braces, then put your while condition and close it with the semicolon again. This is the flowchart for the do-while loop. So do something and then check if your expression is true. If it's true, go back again, do something, and then check the expression again. So the difference is that the do-while loop will execute at least once, while our just regular while loop can not execute at all if the expression evaluates to false on the first run. Now the for loop is a pretest loop, what the for loop does, again, it just checks if your condition is true, and then it's gonna do something. So for loop is a little bit of a different loop. For loop has initialization of a variable, then it has a test of a condition, and then it will update your control variable. So I will show you an example of this. Here are all of the explanations for the sections of the for loop. All you have to know is that the for loop has 3 sections, which we've covered already, and then you just have to know what each section does. So the first section, called initialization, it does simply you initialize your control variable. Then the test section is the condition, basically the same condition as we have in our while and our do while loops. Then the last one is the update section, is the section where you will update your control variable. So whenever you're using the for loop, there's a couple things to consider. First of all, you should avoid updating your control variable in the body of your loop. Your control variable should be updated in the update section of your for loop, of your for loop definition. So it's very important that you update your control variable right here in this update section. So as you can see, update, there's a specific section for it, and you're not updating it anywhere inside of the curly braces. So let me show you a couple of examples of the for loop. So the for loop, you can initialize and update multiple variables, which you will do just like this. So as you can see, for, and then we just initialize our variable. In this case, it's an integer called I that's equal to 5, and an integer called j that equals to 0. Then we check our condition. This is our condition right here, our test. Is I less than 10 or j less than 20? If that is true, this is gonna happen. Some statements are gonna be executed, but this is our condition. This is our test section right here. Then after that, this is our increment section, which is the update section. So what we do, we increment I by 1. Remember, plus plus equals that we incremented by 1, and we increment j by 2. This is the way you would write it in the short version, to increment j by 2. J plus equals 2. So initially, I will get to 10 and j will get to 20. So this way, your loop can exit. And this is a good for loop. This is a good initialization of the variables and the use of a condition and the use of the update section. However, you might see here we have just 4 and 2 semicolons. That is because in the for loop, the only parts that are mandatory are the semicolons. We have one here and we have one here, 2 semicolons. However, in this case, this is an infinite loop, and your for loop will always evaluate to true, since you're not updating any variables and you're not declaring any variables. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is the sentinel values. And we use sentinel values to just tell our program no that to let our program know that we do not want to acquire any more input from the user. And it is usually in your while loop somewhere. There is a condition or something like that that uses a sentinel value, and all it does, once that value is inputted, we let our program know that we do not want anything more. That's all sentinel value will do for you. Now, nested loops are the same idea as the if statements. The same way as we can nest our if statements, we can nest our loops. And while our loops are nested, our inner loop will execute all of the iterations first for each time, while your outer loop executes once. So what it means right here, all of these statements will execute that belong to this for just one execution of your outer loop. So in this case, we have integer j equals 0, j less than 10, j plus plus. So this loop will run 10 times, while this loop will run only once. So 10 times, once. 10 times, 2 times. Sorry, that was a bad explanation. I'll start over. So whenever we have this for loop, this loop is gonna run 10 times when our outer for loop is gonna be on our first iteration. So then this loop will run 10 times more, while our for is gonna be on our second iterations. Then this one is gonna run 10 times more, third iteration, and so on until I reaches 10. So in total, our loop, this thing here, will run 10 multiplied by 10, which is, it's going to be 100 times total. So what does the break statement does? Break statement simply, it's just gonna terminate your loop abnormally. So in case you want your loop to stop iterating when something happens, you can use the break statement. However, it's not really good to use it. It's just gonna bypass all of your normal mechanisms, and it's just harder to read your code and maintain your code. So you should avoid using break sentence statements if you can, but if you cannot, then of course there is such thing as a break statement. Now, what the continue statement will do, continue statement will actually stop your current execution of your loop, and then it will start with the next one. So instead of break will just terminate your loop as a whole. The continue will just terminate the current iteration and start with a new one. Alright, I'm gonna stop right here before our file input and output section of chapter 4, and I will see you guys in the next video where I will be talking about file inputs and file outputs.